Heather, thank you so much for coming and helping us teach grant writing.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure to be here.
I thought we'd start by sharing some wisdom about your grant writing process, the writing process in particular. How do you get started? How do you shift gears? How do you keep other people moving forward?
Sure. Well, I can probably tell my first kind of foray into grant writing, which was when I was a postdoctoral fellow on a institutional T32 from the NIH. Within that, I was not having to do anything else, and I took about 8 weeks to write my very first ever K award that got submitted to the National Institute of Health. Learning from that, I would not recommend that in a way because it's a very lonely space. You're just writing, and maybe having some mentors review some things. And it also is so dedicated to one space that you forget there are other important things that are going on, such as clinical practice or maybe your teaching. So now what I do when I write grants is I really apply about a 6 to 9 month timeline, work on the aims first, work on then after the aims have been through my team and everybody's approved those, then work on the research strategy sections because there's a lot of components to the grant. And so having that 6 to 9 month time gives me opportunities to still take hikes or take some walks and spend time with family and friends, those kinds of things. So you're not just totally gone for a long 24-hour day, 7 days a week, 8-week process to get a grant submitted. So that's what I do now when I write my grants is I give myself plenty of time. I mark it off on the calendar, all the different components, and then I work with my Office of Research Scholarship team members and or any of my other co-Is or consultants that are on, and we set out a timeline, and everybody knows their responsibilities, their what portions they have to have, and I actually send out calendar invites. So when I need something back from them, I send them a calendar invite of when that's going to be due.
Oh, I would really appreciate calendar invites. For me, I've come to really rely on that calendar. If it's not in there, I just can't commit it to my memory.
Yeah.
That's very positive. I guess here's a question. 6 to 9 months sounds like an awful lot of time to write a proposal. What are you doing in that time? And how do you judge how much time other people need when you might be new to a collaboration and you're not sure of their writing style?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the beginning, if you're putting a team together, or if it's you and one other person, you should really have a meeting. Think about all the components. So create yourself a checklist of all the pieces of that particular grant application, whether that's a foundation grant or a grant to NIH or a grant to AHRQ or whoever that funder is. Make sure you've got the checklist in front of you. Then meet with your team, maybe a team of 2, maybe a team of 20, and set those timelines up. And then you, as kind of the lead PI, which is how I see myself, I'm the one that sends out those invitations. But we've already talked about it at the very beginning, so they kind of know it's coming. They may be having, time off from work for whatever reason, or vacations planned. And so we even look at that very first kind of launch meeting as a team that's putting together a grant application.
Do you ever have people say, this is just so early, I can't even possibly think about this grant? Or are they, thank you for getting us on track so I don't have to rush?
Yeah, let me ask that question again, but can you scoot in about 3 inches? Perfect. Okay, good, thanks.
Okay. How do you know, do you find people are able to focus on a grant that far out? Are they saying they don't want to think about it, or do they say, thank you for helping me stay ahead of schedule?
Yeah, I mean, I think they can from a standpoint of their own position, whatever they have going on in their world. So, for example, we talk about, are you looking to join a grant group or a grant team or a program of research related to our funding distributions? And everybody kind of knows what those are, in future. And they're like, I'm excited about the potential of this grant, want to have alignment with their interest. in the interest that I'm proposing. And I have had people say, now it's not a good time, and that's fine, which also is part of putting your team together early on. So then you have a team that's all aligned. They're all interested in the project that's being put forward. And it's not too early because then they know that I'm going to be working on the aims, I'm going to be working on the research strategy, and I'm going to pull them in when it's time, for example, like with my statistician. Okay, we've got the research strategy. I need you to take a look at it because the core components that individual might be writing is the randomization plan or the statistical analysis plan. And that doesn't come till later, but it's really, really helpful to let that person know that it's probably coming in 3 months from now so they can plan ahead as well.
Okay, you are speaking like a very experienced senior researcher. And yet, I knew you. I met you when you were coming out of a postdoc, writing your first major grant. Can you think back to the time where you and other people like you were formulating their first grant to get funding for research so you could be paid to do a day job of research? How did you find, instead of thinking of collaborators, 20 people in the room, how did you find the key mentors who were required for some of these mentored research network mechanisms, rather?
Sure. I think, first off, think big. One of my mentors came onto my team because that was the publication that I carried into the very first day of my PhD journey and said, this is the research I'm going to do for my dissertation. Of course, it was a large, randomized controlled clinical trial with multiple PIs, and my team there at the PhD program said, okay, thanks, Heather, sure. And we kind of, went from there. But when the opportunity came for me to take a postdoc and I was finishing my PhD, cold turkey reaching out and sending the email from that particular publication to say, I love the work that you're doing. It was definitely in line with the work that I wanted to be doing for my career, and the opportunity came. And so finding those mentors from your literature, from the people that you have been reading about, or maybe it's at a conference, but I really encourage you to just reach out, send the emails, or walk right up to them after a presentation at a conference and tell them your name, who you are, and give them your, a short little speech that says this is why you came today to listen to their speech at the conference, and talk about future collaborations. And that's really how those kind of networking that are well aligned of someone you can work with as a mentor and someone that you want to work with. Then you do things like write a publication together, or maybe decide if you wanted to do an op-ed or do different kinds of things to really see if that person fits with your personality and also fits with the kind of your workload to create a good fit between mentor and mentee.
How do you, once you do this, and I love the idea of going to the literature too, because people who are actively publishing are real people out in the world doing good work, and it probably is a year or two after the work has been done, right? Because publication takes so long. So sometimes you catch people and they're just like over it, sick of it, they've moved on just as this publication is coming out. Nevertheless, it's a great way to plug into a group. Maybe they're not interested, but somebody on their team is interested in continuing. I love that, especially for people who aren't at a huge institution where they can go to a seminar and look around who else is in the room with me, make time before grand rounds and after grand rounds just to talk to people, ask somebody to introduce them to somebody else, right? That's something very much in people's power to do.
And you want to put people on your team, whether they're at your institution or an institution that could be anywhere. But collaboratively, if you're aligned in the same types of work that you're wanting to do. So, for example, in my work, it's about improving person-centered care, to improve quality of care for those persons living with serious illness. Having alignment with other people who are having that same goal or that same value or that same belief that they want their program of research to do can be really helpful, because then you can align around that when conflicts come always, but I think if you stay aligned around the purpose that you are working together, then you can get through some of those hard conflicts like budgetary things and all the different things that come when you're working in any kind of team.
Yeah, that's good advice, to hold on to something you can agree upon, even if it's we both really want to improve the lives of patients dealing with serious illness. We can agree. And then we could get to the parts we disagree with.
Yeah.
I guess one question is, do you find people who have shared interest in mission-driven work at topically oriented conferences, or how do you do that?
Sure. So like I said, with the example of the literature, I think that's the number one place, because as researchers, we're all spending a lot of time in the literature and we're seeing who those authors are. When you read that article, you're like, wow, this is amazing and fantastic. Why not email them? See what's up, see what's going on with that. Because I think that then can help, because then maybe you guys happen to be going to the same conference 6 months from now.
Mm-hmm.
So now you've created the connection via the internet, via email. And then you could say, are you happy to be at the, next upcoming conference, which for my field, it's in, the palliative care world. And I've had coffee with them. And that's how I've met all of my mentors outside of my formal educational mentors.
Actually, you just bring up a good point. For many years, I had this rule for myself, and it worked so well, I suggested it for other mentees. I made a little discipline for myself that I would not go to a conference, mostly because I didn't have time, but I needed to be choosy and make it a really high value activity for myself. So I made 3 rules for myself. I would not go to the conference if I didn't have a paper or poster being presented, so I had to submit and get selected. And I didn't have a specific one-on-one meeting, better 2 or 3, with somebody very important to my research that I could meet up with there that I would never be able to see otherwise. So I needed a standing, planned meeting. And if I didn't have those 2 things, I wouldn't let myself go.
Yeah. I think that's the other way. When you meet online, I think you can understand some things, but that in-person space, and part of it too is if you're trying to set up a in-person at the conference and that person doesn't take that time for a 30-minute coffee with you, maybe that's talking volumes that they're too busy, or, they're not interested in, future collaboration. Mm-hmm. So listen to that.
Yes. The other thing some of us have done, I'm not great at this, but sometimes some of our mentees have said, and I have to have a draft of the manuscript in order to go to the conference. So if you made a poster, there's the outline of your manuscript, draft it before you go to the conference. Then any feedback you get, you can quickly incorporate and submit it, and then you're allowed to go to the conference next year.
Yeah. I think the other thing with that is when you have a poster presentation, you do have an outline. So don't let that drop. Get the feedback at the conference or the virtual conference and take that detail onto the next space to create a publication, dissemination, further dissemination. I tell all my students, get a poster presentation, that's your outline, and then from there, we'll continue to work on wheeling this into a publication.
Yes. Now, that brings me to another point, which is pilot data. So often we look at the description of what is required in a grant application. It'll say pilot data is required, not required. I think we might agree that in all cases, it's better to have than to not have, even if it's not formally required. But how do you, does that mean you need a grant to get a grant?
You have to start somewhere. So thinking about grant mechanisms and thinking about the work that you have passion for, hopefully you have some kind of dissemination, whether that's a poster or publication from the work. Maybe it's a narrative review or a metasynthesis of the literature. That is setting you up to say, Is it pilot data in a formal program of research where you're testing efficacy? No. But I think in some grants, it's okay for you to say, this is the pilot data that you've done, and look at the products that we have from that to say you have some expertise in the aims that you're trying to submit. I remember people saying to me in my first grant, which was an F-31 funded by NIH, that I didn't have that pilot data. But it's a training grant, so I think there's some, flexibility there. What did I have? I had the papers that I had been working on during my dissertation. And so we wrote, preliminary data, and I put that in there as not a research preliminary data, but data that we were forming as I put together, the first ever grant that I got funded.
That is a great story. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, this isn't quite accurate to say, but it's mostly accurate, that it actually doesn't cost money to write a paper. It actually does, sort of, because it takes your time. But indirectly speaking, you can you don't need a grant to write a paper and to publish in the peer-reviewed literature. And whatever the basis of that, even if it's, 6 cases that you talk to, it could be a case series, it could be all kinds of low structured things, inexpensive things, you could still get it published, and you can report that as pilot data, and even better to publish it in the peer-reviewed literature, because we know nothing's real unless it's been published, right? So that's where I think early career researchers just starting out, you don't have to try so hard to get a grant, even though everybody loves somebody that somebody else has funded. It's like, oh, that place took a chance on you, then maybe we should take a chance on you. So I want to talk about mechanisms in that regard. But nevertheless, the first lowest hurdle is some kind of evidence this is a good idea in any way. And citing literature, fine. Even better, citing yourself with some kind of finding.
Yeah, well, and I think in the training space, I didn't have a lot of publications on my CV or on my NIH BioSketch when I was submitting that first grant, but making very strategic choices of who I put on as mentors. I think in the training space, whether that's an F or a K award, it's not just you're bringing your mentors forward. Mm-hmm. So making sure that those mentors look like they align well with what you're proposing for your independent project also makes sense. And I remember talking to program officers, they're like, this isn't all about just you. This is about your mentor team. So I think that's just as important to think about strength of CVs and biosketches of the mentors that you might be asking to join your team, because then the funder knows that these people have a track record of being successful, which only then helps you be successful as well.
Yes, and let me build on that. You want mentors who are highly qualified from an education and experience perspective in their science, right? So, if you're bringing somebody on as a methodologic expert, you want them to be an expert in that, or content expert that. And for a mentored career development grant, which is what most clinical researchers are trying for the first time, those key mentors are at a minimum, the primary mentor needs to have evidence of mentoring people like you.
Yep.
That the track record of helping somebody along in their early research career is at least as important as being a competent scientist in their own right.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's the rub, right? You find some amazing Dr. Fabulous scientist, and they've never really done a lot of dedicated mentoring. They don't have a track record of K awardees. And then you'll have somebody who has this amazing track record mentoring people, and they're adequate as a researcher, but they're not, really top drawer. And the grant could really use both. They really need both.
Well, and I remember distinctly one of my program officers, there's a leading, nursing palliative care researcher in the field that everyone knows. And I said, well, I'm going to ask her to be a mentor. And my program officer said to me, yes, and we know that this person's too busy to be a mentor for 40 different people. And so that won't look favorably for you. So I would consider perhaps some other individuals. And so I chose not to put her on as a mentor, even though she kind of aligned with what I was doing. And I think the other thing is you do want someone who does have time for you. If they're a mentor, hopefully they're signing on to actually be a mentor, not just a name that's on the paper that's going to the grant award, because you need help when you're in that training space.
Absolutely. I agree with you. And I think sometimes mentors don't mean to overextend. They don't mean to leave people hanging. Often they started out being that amazing primary mentor for a number of people, and then their portfolio grew and their mentor's portfolio grew, and all of a sudden it's just not possible. But in their mind, they want to be that guy or gal who's the guy. They can't be the guy. And so then I think it's best to be really open with them about it. And hopefully most people get pretty real and they say, we need either a co-primary mentor where, you know, I'll be providing this senior guidance and this other person will pick up the slack on actual day-to-day, or I'll take a different role, that I'll be in a supportive role to this other person and help the next crowd get up.
Yeah.
Because it's just really easy to think that nobody knows that this person's too busy, but the field knows. Yeah. The field definitely knows.
Well, and I think that's back to another checklist of like creating a mentor team table for yourself and making sure that mentors that are joining you know what you're asking them to do. Does this mean you are coming in for this particular expertise, which means one meeting a month? Or you're coming in for this particular expertise, which means I need to meet with you every week. Like having those clear expectations from the get-go, then everyone knows what they're signing on for. And you aren't out there going, well, this person won't meet with me, but if you didn't tell them you needed to meet with them weekly at the beginning in an actual documented mentor table that says your name, their name, and what they're doing for you in this particular team, then I think people have unknown expectations. It's not that they didn't want to help you,
right.
But if you have clear expectations from the beginning, then I think it just helps from some of those, conflicts that may arise. And life still happens, right? Families need families, and life things are happening. We went through a pandemic that made everything change. So I think those kinds of negotiations along the way, when life happens for both the mentor or the mentee, to say, this is what's going on. I had that conversation today with one of my mentees that said, this is going on in my life, and I'm sorry I'm not going to have as much time for you over the next month, but, take me off the publication because I don't have time to look at that over this next month. So I think it's those kinds of clear expectations at the beginning and along the process of the relationship.
Okay, so when you say make a table that describes expectations, are you talking about sort of like a compact contract that the two people fill out together? Or are you talking about for you, for your own thinking, who's the team you have, who's covering what bases, sort of like a strategic plan for getting all the expertise you need separate?
The table is for me, and with me leading my program of research, but I make sure that those people who are on the team have seen that table.
Okay.
And maybe adjusted, right? Maybe I've said, I want to meet with you every week. And they say, well, I can't meet with you every week, but in this role, how about if we meet every other week? And so then it's a negotiation space. And then we have that table. And, I can be comfortable in 9 months from now, if they've been canceling all the meetings that I've put on their calendars, then I can say, this is what we talked about at the beginning because we already had the conversation. And so I think it just helps drive the space when, things are sometimes topsy-turvy and just the busy lives that both the mentor and the mentee are living.
Well, certainly at one moment in time, if you can be in agreement with a plan that works for both of you and honestly talk things through, then you have a great foundation to adapt and change together. At least you've come together on this one topic. I've seen how many times, and it's not really somebody's fault particularly, but I mean, how many special set aside funding grant opportunities will come out, the week after Thanksgiving. And they say, great news, we're going to give you 6 whole weeks. It's due the week after New Year's. And you say, what? I was not going to spend my holiday writing this grant.
Yeah.
And, you've got to get on the same page real fast. Because back to your suggestion to use 6 to 9 months for a grant, ideal, good.
Yeah.
When possible, be planful. And yet, sometimes there are special things that come up. Literally, they only announce it with very short timelines. Sometimes I'm convinced they do that simply to not cast such a wide net. They don't want every person and their brother applying to this. Yeah. The only people that could rally to this timeline already have this kind of work written. Yeah. But it doesn't change the fact that you have to mobilize your group on a very short timeline. How do you do that in a way that doesn't drive people mad or, feel put upon or, unfairly asked to work to your timelines?
I mean, I think in the short answer, if you've been submitting things all along and perhaps getting rejected and submitting and getting rejected and submitting and getting rejected, you have a good base, which allows you then to think about if a special call comes out, you see it, somebody sends it to you and says, oh, Heather, this would be perfect for you. You should submit. And it may be a 6-week turnaround. Because you've been building this around this whatever types of topics, I think you could put something together in a shorter time frame. Mm-hmm. And so then you just reach out to that same kind of team and say, look, there's a special call. Here's the deadline. I'm going to do this. And you divide the components and you go to work and you spend that very intensive time. And I know during the pandemic, there were many of those things happening because there were special calls and people all sat down and maybe wrote something in 2 weeks, like an R01 to the NIH, but all hands on deck for 2 weeks, to get those kind of calls in. So I think those aren't to say no to, but if you've been working in that kind of space, I think you have good foundations of things you can cut and paste from other grants to bring over.
And to be realistic that if it really is a bit of a stretch, you have nothing to draw on. You would be going from scratch. You'd be mobilizing this team that has never worked in this way, in this timeline before. I would be very careful not to, burn people over some possible maybe grant.
If you're starting literature review in that shorter time frame, unlikely that you will, one, have a great team that can put the best foot forward in a short amount of time. But if it's aligned with exactly where you've already been doing the work, and I think it also leans into your publications, right? If you have publications that are aligned with that call that just came out, then you can show pilot data. You could show preliminary data. You could show work in that particular type of area, which I think also helps reviewers say, oh, this person's working in this field. They already are having publications and disseminating in this field. And then they feel more comfortable saying, well, yeah, let's give you the money. So if it's something completely the opposite, consider whether you want to take that on and do it in such a short time frame.
Right. Let me ask you one more question before we shift gears. I want to ask you about writing to different kinds of funders. You've mentioned, the alphabet soup of federal healthcare funding, FT, KR, out of the National Institutes of Health, NIH, and there's lots of foundation funders or professional association funders. Yeah. You're a palliative care expert. Can you talk about how you strategize using philanthropy or private funding versus federal funding?
Yeah, I mean, I was lucky or successful, submitting my first grant to the National Institute of Health during my as a predoctoral, which is the F, the alphabet soup. From that, though, thinking about diversifying your portfolio, thinking about foundations, thinking about nursing for me, since I'm in nursing organizations, and also thinking about collaborations with others. So, for example, in persons living with serious illness, the American Cancer Society. And so collaborating with a medical oncologist, even though I have some cancer clinical experience, and thinking about putting protocols and programs of research together with different types of funders. Some of those can be just as large in a dollar sense from the federal funding from the NIH, so don't rule those out. Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, the Macy Foundation, and I think then, the Parkinson's Foundation, Alzheimer's Association, all of those large organizations that are national organizations do have funding. And so don't rule those out if you're in a space that just says, oh, you need NIH funded. Because I think at this point in my career, now I've had the F and I've had the K and working on trying to get that first kind of big RO1, I'm having to think about those other foundations too, because you really need to diversify your portfolio.
Yes. I guess there's a couple of things I want to reflect on. One, any of us who've ever done health services research, health systems research, patient-centered outcomes research, often we're talking about whole life humans that are complicated, and many of the institutes of health are disease specific. Yep. So either we fit in multiple institutes or no institutes. And so you're constantly trying to adapt to align with their strategic initiatives. So foundations are a requirement because many foundations do tend to be more topically oriented, cross-cutting, maybe methodological. So, health disparities, quality of life, things that are not bucketed quite the same in NIH. So that helps from a topic perspective. And then I think they tend to be a little bit clubbier, and they're willing to sort of take a shot at an early career researcher who seems to have, to your point, papers, some kind of track record that proves they have a long-standing interest and commitment to this area. They're not like, oh, there's a person of a certain age in my study, I'm going to submit to the National Institute on Aging or whatever, that the paper trail is part of proof that you care, right? And that can be very powerful in foundations.
And I tell my students now that, when they're thinking about funding, whether it's a $5,000 grant or a $5 million grant, you must take some time to go to that funder's page that's called strategic objectives or, our mission, vision, and value. And if those words of that strategic objective or the mission, vision, values jump off the page to you and say, this is exactly what I'm going to be doing, then you have great alignment for whatever that funding or that funder is. So if those words that they've taken time to put on this website or put on a flyer that says this is what we're funding align wonderfully with the work that you see yourself doing, then that's where you need to put your time and energy and go for it, whether it's 5,000 or 5 million.
That's great advice. I will say when I was on the review panel for the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, HRQ, from time to time, a grant would come in that was so clearly written for an NIH institute, and they just changed a little bit and they reformatted so they could try again. And it fell very flat because they were not really picking up on the priorities of that entity. And it was, great team, great study, but it did not fare well in review.
Yeah. It doesn't matter whether it's a federal grant or a foundation grant. There's a reason they earmark and say, this is our strategic objective to the monies that's available. So you better make sure that you're aligned with that.
Yes. And it's in the public domain, right? So there's no excuse for not really tailoring every grant.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Let's turn to resubmission. So getting a grant, darn it, it didn't get funded. That's more common than not. How do you manage rejection, and how do you prepare to resubmit?
Well, as I've mentioned, I haven't been funded on any grant the very first time. So I just plan into that timeline with my career workload and my bosses and all of the things that you need to be talking to when you're thinking about your grants, that it's going to maybe the second time, be funded. So again, 6 to 9 months, you submit it, you get the review back, another 6 to 9 months, or maybe 3 months if you turn it around quickly, depending on what those reviewers' comments are, if there's not significant things that need to be changed. Once I get that review, I just take some time, get the summary statement if it's from an NIH, or hopefully with foundations, you get some feedback. But I have had some foundations that don't give feedback, so I would definitely, talk with whoever is leading that to try to get whatever feedback you can. And then I make a 2x2 table. All reviewer comments on one side. I spend a month or so, or two, responding to each one of those. Doesn't mean that I'm going to specifically change something within the grant, but perhaps I didn't write it clear enough, so I need to provide more references to support a methodology. For example, in like qualitative, I get a lot of interesting review comments, and I'm like, this person didn't understand, which is fine. I'm not changing that in my research approach, but I do need to provide more clarity in the way I wrote it and what I mean, and provide then supporting references. And so then I fill out that second column with how I'm going to respond to that. That 2x2 table then helps me and my team, because there may be some things like I'm not a quantitative expert. So my statistician needs to help me formulate or think about what that response is going to be and what we might change. So in that 2x2 table with all the reviewer comments on one side, all my responses back, then that's how we then approach changing the previous grant application, or just clarifying and adding more references.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. And what if your team, some people think you should make a change and some people think you should sort of hold fast and defend? How do you manage that? And how do you respond to review? How do you tell reviewers, great idea, agree, we need more information, and I'm not changing this thing? How do you do that?
Well, I think with the National Institute of Health process, you get 3 reviewers. So you can have reviewer 1, reviewer 2, and reviewer 3. And maybe reviewer 2 and reviewer 3 are in complete contrast from what they're saying to you. So I think
maybe at least once in every review, right?
Yeah. So I think it's really about what makes sense for the science, and you are the expert in that science. So don't just change something based on a reviewer comment if it's changing the science and it's doing science that you didn't envision that you would be doing. So I can talk about this in like the quantitative versus the qualitative. I get reviews all the time that say, this qualitative data that you're collecting is not important because it's not testing efficacy with quantitative outcomes. But for me, it's really important that I continue to have that contextual factors with the qualitative aims, with the qualitative approach in the research strategy section, and testing efficacy and testing quantitative outcomes. So I think it's important for you to understand what you want to be doing, respond to reviewers' comments, but don't change things if they take you in such a direction that it doesn't fit what you want to be doing, right? You don't want to do a grant or get funded for a grant that you don't want to do.
So true. All right, we call it the winner's curse.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, don't write a grant you don't want, because it'll be the one that gets funded.
Yeah.
Right. And, I think that's part of learning how to respond like a scientist. If a comment is given in good faith and really has a real expert has come forward with this position, you should take it seriously. Mm-hmm. I mean, assuming they didn't totally misunderstand because you didn't explain it well, but they did get it. They disagree with you. Really be curious, non-judgmental, non-threatening, and try to dig out what can you learn from this perspective. can it advance the story you're trying to tell?
And I would say with the reviews that you get, with the rejections that you most definitely will have, with each iterative cycle of a rejection with a review and your response to the reviewer, it is getting better. Your science is getting better. So
I will say over time, I mean, I believe that, but I really, really believe that when you've had a number of grants funded where you can look back at 1 or 2 prior submissions and you go, oh my gosh, that thing, there were some real problems with this thing. I mean, how could I possibly have submitted this? The final product is so much better. It's so much tighter. You really have ferreted out some problems, and you can feel like authentically grateful to those reviewers and to the process, even though nobody likes to be told no.
Yeah.
And you don't want to spend more time doing this. You just want to do the work. But it really does get better. And then you can feel better about getting it. Like, oh, once you get past the darn it, why wasn't this clear? You can get pretty constructive. Heather, thank you so much for sharing your experience, because everybody gets rejected. And we know the way to get funded is to resubmit, not start from scratch. So thanks for sharing love the Matt stories.
Yeah. Well, and thanks for having me. I think the things I've learned through the rejections is taking some time to say, do you still want to do this work? Is this the work that you want to do? And at this point, I come back to that every day and say, yes, I want to improve care for persons living with serious illness in our healthcare system today. So I'm going to redo that grant and listen to the reviewers and get it resubmitted so I can work on improving care.
I'm so glad you're doing that work. Thank you.